Mela Brandt didn't remember the moment her life became a transaction. It didn't happen in a dramatic burst, with slammed doors or screamed ultimatums. It was quieter than that, so quiet she almost missed it. The papers had been signed weeks earlier, slipped between other meaningless documents by her foster guardian, a woman who drank too much and loved too little. The signature wasn't forged. Mila had signed it herself. She remembered the pen in her hand, the way the woman hovered beside her, saying it was paperwork for a scholarship or something about her age and emancipation. She hadn't read it. She just wanted the woman to stop talking, to stop looking at her like a debt she couldn't pay off. That was how it started. Not with a bang, but with a lie dressed up as bureaucracy. When the car came, it didn't look like danger. It was sleek, black, spotless, and silent. The driver wore a navy coat and leather gloves, and he didn't speak. He held the door open like this was a courtesy, like she had a choice. Mela didn't ask where they were going. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of hearing her confusion. If someone had paid to take her, the least she could do was stay silent. The drive lasted hours. They moved out of the city, past farmlands and rusted barns, into mountains and winding roads that climbed higher and higher until her phone lost signal and the trees swallowed the sky. When they reached the gate, Mela still didn't feel afraid. She felt numb, like her body had gone on ahead of her, like she was watching herself from a few steps behind. The estate loomed at the top of a long hill. It wasn't a castle. It was too modern for that. Low stone, steel beams, black windows that reflected the trees instead of revealing anything inside. No one greeted her. The driver opened the door, gestured to the steps, and said only one thing. "He'll be in touch." Then he was gone. She climbed the stairs alone, dragging the cheap duffel bag she'd had since she was 17. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cool, still, and filled with the kind of silence that came from insulation, not absence. Everything looked like it had been cleaned recently, but not lived in. There were no shoes by the door, no jackets hung on hooks, no signs of daily life, only minimalist furniture, thick rugs, and empty picture frames. A handwritten note lay on the kitchen counter. No envelope, no signature. "You'll find everything you need upstairs. No one will enter your space without permission. You're not required to do anything. If you need something, use the phone in the study. You'll be safe here." It was the last sentence that made her skin crawl. Not because it wasn't kind, but because it was kind. Kindness, in her experience, came with a price. She didn't believe in it, not without motive. She found her room on the second floor. It was more than a bedroom. It was a suite, with a private bathroom, a reading nook by a wide window, and a bed so large she felt absurd setting her single, worn bag beside it. On the nightstand was a bottle of water, a folded robe, and a second note: "Rest. No one will disturb you." Mela didn't unpack. She lay down on top of the blanket, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. She didn't sleep. Her mind spun in a slow, controlled circle, trying to understand what this was. There had been no rules, no demands, no locked doors or leering smiles. Just a house, a room, a promise of safety she didn't believe. She stayed in the room until morning. No one came. No sounds echoed from downstairs, not even music. By the second day, the silence became unbearable. She ventured into the hallways. The house was larger than it seemed from the outside. Split-level corridors, rooms hidden behind sliding panels, staircases that turned sharply and seemed to go nowhere. Some doors were locked. Others opened into cold, empty spaces filled with books or art supplies or nothing at all. On the third night, something changed. She was in the kitchen, staring at a row of unfamiliar spices, when she felt it. Presence. Someone watching. She turned. He was standing in the archway. Tall, dressed in dark gray, with hands in his pockets and a face that held nothing and everything at once. He looked like a man sculpted from a single idea: order. His hair was silver at the temples, but his eyes were young and sharp. He said nothing, just looked at her. Mila didn't move. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice low and precise. She tilted her head slightly. "And what did you expect?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped further into the kitchen and reached for a glass of water. Something broken, something desperate, something easy to control. She didn't blink. "I'm not broken. I can see that now. She hated how calm his voice was. Not soothing, measured. Like everything he said had passed through a filter of logic before it was allowed to touch the air. You paid for me, she said flatly. I paid for you to be safe. That's not what people usually mean when they pay for girls. He turned to face her fully now, leaning against the counter. I didn't bring you here to touch you. I brought you here because no one else did. Because someone had to. Mela didn't respond. She didn't believe him. Not yet, maybe not ever. He set the glass down and walked past her, slowly, deliberately, like he was giving her space without asking for trust. At the doorway, he paused. My name is August, he said. You don't owe me anything. You don't belong to me. You can leave whenever you choose. Then he left her alone again. And for the first time in years, Mela didn't feel owned. She felt watched, studied, but not used. Not yet. And that was somehow more terrifying. The following morning, the house felt warmer, not in temperature, but in presence. As sunlight crept through the tall, glass windows and softened the sharp lines of the architecture, Mila stepped out of her room, barefoot, wrapped in the soft robe that had been left for her days ago. She had slept uneasily, turning over August's words again and again until her mind grew too heavy to carry them. Still, she hadn't come to any conclusions. She didn't trust him, but she also didn't feel in danger. It was a strange and disorienting combination. She wasn't used to this kind of stillness. The kitchen was empty, as usual. The silence in the house wasn't neglectful, it was intentional. Everything was designed for quiet, for control. Even the appliances hummed barely audibly. The counters were spotless. A bowl of fruit had been placed on the table overnight, the kind of touch that would have felt domestic if it didn't reek of precision. Nothing in this house happened by chance. And yet the longer she stayed, the more uncertain she became of what exactly was expected of her. She made herself a cup of tea, more for something to do than out of habit, and took it into the sunroom that overlooked the back gardens. The room had no curtains, just clean open glass that wrapped around three walls, inviting in a pale golden light and the view of wild, frost-covered hedges and distant trees. She sat in the corner, curled in an oversized chair, and stared at the horizon, where the fog clung to the tips of the forest like a second sky. There was beauty here. She could admit that. But beauty meant nothing if you couldn't relax long enough to absorb it. August didn't appear until nearly noon. She didn't hear him approach. His steps were soft, confident, the kind that belonged to someone who had long ago learned how to exist without disrupting his environment. He entered the sunroom with a book in his hand and a subtle nod in her direction, as though greeting a colleague rather than a girl he'd extracted from a dying situation. You found this room, he said, almost conversationally, his voice calm, low. Mela didn't look at him directly. It wasn't hidden. No, he agreed, but most people don't notice it. They walk through, never stop. Maybe they weren't trying to find a place to hide. He said nothing to that. She glanced at him now and noticed the way he leaned on the doorway instead of sitting. He kept distance deliberately, not out of awkwardness, but as if he'd calculated how close was too close for someone like her. She couldn't decide whether to be grateful for it or suspicious. I thought you'd ask more questions by now, he said finally. She sipped her tea, then set it down carefully. I've learned not to ask questions when I already know the answers are controlled. He smiled faintly, the expression soft but not without weight. And you assume my answers would be? Don't you control everything in your world, August? His name still felt strange in her mouth, intimate in a way that felt like a risk. He shrugged, neither denying nor confirming. Control is a way of surviving. So is silence. They stared at each other across the room for a long moment, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be broken. Then finally she asked the question that had been clawing at her since the first night. Why me? He pushed off from the doorframe and stepped further into the room, but didn't come closer than a few feet. I told you before. You reminded me of someone. That's not an answer. That's a deflection. He nodded once. Yes, it is. Mila stood, the robe falling around her legs like soft armor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move aggressively, but there was something solid in her stance, something grounded and fed up with half-truths. I was taken from a house where no one cared if I ate or slept or bled. One night, they just said I was going with someone new. They handed me over like I was expired milk. And then I was here, with all this quiet and clean and space, but I still don't know if I'm meant to disappear in luxury or if I'm just being stored for later. August didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed to listen more closely, like he was measuring every word she threw at him. "You're not being stored," he said, "and I have no intention of hurting you. Ever." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to feel what safety feels like, so that when you leave, you'll remember it." She blinked. "So I am supposed to leave?" He tilted his head slightly. "Eventually, if you want to." The honesty in his voice startled her more than a lie would have. There was no seductive promise, no manipulation, just quiet, firm truth. Mila sat back down, not because the conversation was over, but because she needed to collect herself. He wasn't playing the game she expected, and that unsettled her more than anything. Later that day, she wandered the house again, this time more deliberately. She began to notice things she hadn't before. The way the light hit the hallway mirrors just slightly off-center, the faint scratch marks on one of the doors in the west wing, the room full of art supplies untouched but clearly arranged by someone who used to care. She opened books at random from the shelves. Most were annotated, underlined in fine pencil. Philosophy, psychology, architecture. Nothing lazy, all deliberate. She came across a room filled with photographs late in the afternoon. It wasn't locked. Nothing in this house was, which made it more sinister in its own way. It was trust that felt like a test. Inside the room were black and white photos, some framed, some tacked to corkboards. Most were landscapes, cityscapes, all captured with painful precision. But in one corner was a cluster of portraits. Her, from different angles, different seasons. A shot of her on the steps of the shelter at 17. Another of her walking alone down a street she barely remembered. A blurry shot from behind, seated on a bench. Her breath caught. She wasn't scared, yet. She was stunned. This was more than surveillance. It was observation, studied, archived, intimate. She turned as August entered the room. He didn't look surprised to find her there. He stood in the doorway, watching her take in the images. "I started following you after I read a report from a friend who works in child welfare," he said. He mentioned a girl who refused every placement, who kept running away, but always went back to school, always kept her grades up, always kept her head down. Mila didn't speak. She didn't move. "I thought I could help from a distance," he said, "but distance is a convenient form of cowardice." She turned to him, her voice low, cold. "You watched me grow up through a lens." "Yes." "And then you decided to take me." "No. I decided to offer you what no one else did. The choice to stop being watched. The choice to just be." Mela's eyes narrowed. "And how is that a choice if I didn't know I was part of it?" August looked away for the first time since the conversation began. "You're right," he said quietly. "That part I stole, and I regret it." She walked past him without another word and went back to her room, her head buzzing. That night she didn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was the unbearable weight of being seen. The next morning, Mila didn't get out of bed. She stayed beneath the covers with the curtains half drawn and her back to the door, even though she knew no one would enter without her permission. That was the part that disturbed her the most. No matter how much she tried to prepare herself for control, for force, for the kind of power men like August Rourke were supposed to exert, he gave her nothing of the sort. He gave her space, autonomy. And that freedom, that careful distance, only made her question more deeply why she had been brought here at all. She hadn't spoken to him since she'd discovered the photographs. She'd barely looked at his face during the encounter, but her mind kept playing over his words. "I stole that part, and I regret it." The fact that he had admitted it so plainly unsettled her. Not because he had regrets. Any man could lie about guilt. But because she hadn't seen calculation in him when he said it. She'd seen something else. Something close to shame. She finally rose in the late afternoon. The air had cooled, and the soft gray of an overcast sky draped itself across the house. It suited the mood of the place. Even when light poured in, the house remained somehow somber, as if built not just with stone and steel, but with grief baked into its foundation. Her bare feet moved soundlessly along the floorboards as she made her way to the kitchen, unsure if she was looking for food or proof that the world outside her room still existed. He was there. Of course he was. August stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, chopping herbs like a man preparing for war. His movements were precise, methodical, and oddly quiet, the blade of the knife meeting the wooden board with a rhythm that was almost meditative. She paused at the threshold and watched him. He noticed her the way he noticed the wind. Subtle shift in posture, no direct eye contact, but an awareness that adjusted the space between them. "I didn't expect to see you today," he said. "I live here," she replied. "You do," he said with a nod. "For now." She walked in slowly, sitting at the far end of the long kitchen island. Her hands were folded in front of her, fingers curling and uncurling, as if even they didn't know how to settle. "I want to know why you chose me," she said, her voice steady. "The real reason, not the polished one." August put down the knife, wiped his hands on a towel, and leaned against the counter. His expression remained unreadable, but his silence told her he was measuring how much he could reveal without pushing her away again. "I could tell you it was because you reminded me of my sister," he said slowly. "Because that would be partly true. The shape of your eyes, the way you held yourself in that photo from the shelter, like the walls were caving in and you didn't care. I saw her in that. And yes, I felt something. Guilt, recognition, maybe hope." Mela tilted her head. But it wasn't just that," he continued, quieter now. "The truth is, I saw you survive things no one your age should have survived. Not dramatically, not with spectacle. Quietly, with an endurance most people never find. I didn't rescue you. I observed you long enough to know you didn't need rescuing. What I offered you was a place to stop fighting, even if only for a little while." She stared at him, unsure whether to feel disgusted or strangely seen. There was something deeply unnerving about being chosen for endurance. It meant someone had been watching not just what happened to her, but how she endured it. It made her feel like an experiment, like a subject. "Do you understand how messed up that is?" she asked. "That you watched me suffer, then gave me a house and thought it made up for it?" "I never thought it made up for anything," he said. "This place wasn't about redemption. It was about pause. For you. For me. For the idea that two people can exist in the same space without taking from each other." Mila stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the trees rustled in the early evening wind, tall and sharp and indifferent. She pressed her hand to the glass, almost hoping it would be cold enough to burn. "Everyone always wanted something from me," she said quietly. "My body, my silence, my compliance. You're the first person who offered nothing. And somehow, that feels worse." August stepped forward, not close enough to touch, but close enough for her to feel his presence. "I offered what I could," he said. "Not as a man, as a coward. A man who didn't know how to enter someone else's life without leaving a scar. So I built a house where I wouldn't have to touch the world. Then I saw you and I realized maybe I wasn't the only one hiding." She turned to him now. Her eyes weren't angry. They weren't soft either. They were precise. "I'm not your mirror." "I know. I'm not a replacement." "I know that too." "Then stop looking at me like I'm the piece that makes your puzzle make sense." His eyes met hers. Not with challenge, not with regret, just with stillness. "I don't need you to make me whole," he said. "But I think I'd like to learn how to be real beside you." Mela didn't respond. Instead, she walked past him, through the kitchen, and into the dining room, where she sat at the table without asking if she was welcome. She didn't know what was happening between them. It wasn't love. Not yet. It wasn't safety either. Not really. But it was the beginning of something that neither of them had language for. He followed, not hurriedly. He set 2 plates down, one in front of her, one across the table. They ate in near silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. A man and a girl, no longer strangers, not yet companions, seated together in a house full of locked doors that were slowly, one by one, beginning to open. That night when Mela returned to her room, she found a book placed on her pillow. It was a copy of The Plague by Camus, with a note inside. The handwriting was sharp and neat. "To endure suffering is not weakness. To name it is power." Abe, She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But she read the first chapter before sleeping. And for the first time since arriving, she dreamed of something that didn't hurt. The rain came heavy on the fourth night, slamming into the roof and windows with a rhythm so relentless it seemed almost angry. The storm rolled over the hills like something alive, shaking the trees and turning the world outside into a dark blur of movement and sound. Inside the house, it was as silent as ever, though the storm pressed against the walls as if trying to force its way in. Maela stood barefoot in the hallway, watching the downpour through the large front windows. Her reflection caught faintly in the glass. The storm suited her. It made sense. Something wild and loud against a house full of quiet restraint. She had not seen August all day. It was not unusual. He often disappeared into his study or into one of the locked rooms in the East Wing. But today felt different. The house hadn't been reset. No fresh fruit in the kitchen. No folded linens in the laundry basket. No signs that the invisible system that usually kept the place immaculate was working. It felt abandoned, paused, like something had broken the rhythm. She didn't know whether to be concerned or grateful. Part of her had grown used to his occasional presence, not as comfort, not even as familiarity, but as confirmation that she was not alone in the structure. After hours of pacing and picking at her food, Mela finally gathered the courage to knock on his door. She told herself it was for clarity, maybe closure, maybe to prove she wasn't afraid of him. But beneath that, she couldn't lie. There was a quiet pull, a need to understand what tethered her to this place. August didn't answer. She waited, then slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open into a room that smelled of ink and old wood. Books were stacked everywhere, on tables, on the floor, along the walls in uneven shelves. A soft light from a desk lamp glowed at the far end, where he sat, hunched forward in a high-back leather chair, hands covering his face. She almost backed out of the room, thinking she had invaded something sacred, but his voice stopped her before she could leave. Stay. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a request. It was more like an admission. She closed the door behind her and stepped cautiously into the room, her eyes scanning the spines of the books. Some were familiar, philosophy, economics, poetry, but many were in languages she couldn't read. On one of the shelves near the window was a framed photograph, face down. She paused in front of it, glancing at him. Can I? He nodded without lifting his head. She turned the frame over. The photo inside was of a young girl, no older than 13, laughing with her arms around a boy slightly older, maybe 15 or 16. Her hair was wild, her eyes bright. There was no mistaking it. August was the boy, and the girl beside him was someone Marla had never seen before. But she felt as if she knew her. She held that kind of energy, untamed, too alive. My sister, he said quietly. Isabel. Mila set the photo down gently. She didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. She ran away at 17. I thought she was being dramatic. I told her she was too sensitive, that the world would chew her up. We fought. She left that night. 2 years later, they found her in a squat house. Overdose. No one knew how long she'd been gone before someone even noticed. His voice didn't crack. It didn't rise. It was steady, cold, like he'd repeated the story so many times in his head that the emotion had been drained from it, leaving only the structure of facts behind. I blamed everyone, the system, her friends, myself. I donated. I lobbied. I tried to fix the holes she fell through, but it didn't make a difference. I watched it happen to other girls again and again, so I stopped watching. Until you. Mela moved to the chair opposite him and sat, folding her legs beneath her. She didn't know what to say. There were no right words, no soft answers. You thought I was going to die, she said. I thought you were already disappearing. She looked at him now, his eyes hollow and his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the whiskey glass beside him. I didn't want to own you, Mala. I just didn't know how else to keep someone from vanishing. And you thought buying me would stop it? I thought removing you from what was killing you might give you time to choose something else. She leaned back in the chair, absorbing that. It made sense in a strange, broken way. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it framed it differently. He hadn't acted from desire, or even from guilt. He had acted out of grief, desperate, misguided grief. You never asked me what I wanted, she said. You're right. You still haven't. He looked at her now, really looked, his eyes meeting hers without armor. "What do you want, Myella?" The question hit harder than it should have, because no one had ever asked her that. Not really. Her life had been a series of choices made by other people, all disguised as favors or necessities. And now, faced with a real question, with real permission, she wasn't sure how to answer. "I want," she started, then stopped. "I want to stop being afraid all the time, of people, of kindness, of waking up tomorrow and having everything change again. I want something I can trust, even if it's small." August's gaze didn't leave her. "You can have that here, but not because you owe me, and not because I earned it." The storm outside cracked, thunder splitting the sky open. Mela stood and walked slowly to the window, watching the rain cascade in sheets. Behind her she could feel the weight of him, his regret, his silence. She turned back around. "You can't fix what happened to her by saving me." "I know," he said. "I'm not here to be a second chance." "You're not," he said, more firmly now. "You're the first chance I've ever had to do something without trying to erase my own shame." Mila nodded. "Then maybe we can start from there." He stood slowly and stepped beside her at the window, not touching, not crowding, just there. They stood together in silence for a long time, listening to the storm calm itself against the glass. Neither of them spoke again that night, but in the quiet, something shifted, not erased, not repaired, just shifted, slightly like a weight being moved from one hand to the other. And for the first time since she had arrived, Mila didn't feel like something that had been taken. She felt like someone who had been found. The morning after the storm, the house was drenched in a gray hush. Everything was still, too still. The rain had stopped, but the world hadn't yet remembered how to move. The trees outside were dripping silently, and a light fog hung over the forest like it had decided to stay a little longer before lifting. Maella woke slowly, the heaviness of the previous night still sitting in her bones. Her dreams had been dense with blurred memories. Hallways that never ended, doors that wouldn't open, voices she didn't recognize but knew were hers. She got dressed in silence. The clothes in the closet no longer felt like borrowed things. They had become part of her new, strange reality, stitched into the quiet ritual of her days. She didn't feel like she belonged in the house, but she didn't feel like she was just visiting anymore either. It was an in-between space, and she wasn't sure whether that unsettled her or gave her room to breathe. When she entered the kitchen, she found August already there. He was reading a newspaper, not on a tablet or screen, but a physical one, folded neatly at the corners like everything else he touched. He didn't look up when she walked in, and she didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was lived in now, familiar in a way that said more than conversation could. She poured herself a cup of coffee, he'd already brewed it, of course, and sat across from him at the table. She studied him as he read. He was always so composed, so impossibly still, like the world only moved when he allowed it to. But now, after the night they'd shared in his study, she saw things she hadn't noticed before. The weariness beneath his eyes. The way his fingers tapped against the ceramic mug when he was thinking. The pause in his breath when he was about to speak but decided against it. He finally looked up, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. His voice was quiet, like it was meant only for the room they were in. "You stayed." Mila held his gaze. "I did. Most people wouldn't have." "I'm not most people." He nodded almost to himself, like she'd confirmed something he'd long suspected. Then after a pause, he said, "Would you like to go somewhere today?" That caught her off guard. "Somewhere?" "There's a place, not far. I used to go there when I needed to remember the world was bigger than me." She didn't answer right away. The idea of leaving the house, of breaking the strange cocoon of it, felt risky, but not dangerous. It felt like stepping into something that could reshape her, or at the very least show her who she was now, outside the safety of carefully measured silence. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." They left after breakfast. August drove a modest car, not one of the sleek, soulless vehicles she'd imagined someone like him would own. It was quiet and clean, like everything else he chose to surround himself with. The drive was slow, winding through thick forest roads that blurred into themselves. They didn't speak much. He let her play music, soft and ambient, something that filled the car without forcing conversation. The place he took her was a lake, not a glamorous one, not crowded with tourists or framed by docks. It was tucked between two hills, wide and silver, its surface still like glass. A narrow trail led from the gravel lot down to the water, and they walked side by side, neither reaching for the other, but not straying far either. When they reached the edge, Mela stepped forward, breathing in the scent of wet pine and earth. The wind was gentle here, just enough to move the surface of the lake in quiet ripples. She felt it, something loosen inside her, a tension she hadn't known she was carrying. It wasn't peace, but it was the closest she'd come to it in years. August sat on a large flat stone and waited for her to speak, but she didn't. Instead, she walked a slow circle near the water, letting herself exist without needing to explain. When she finally joined him, he didn't look at her. He just said, "Isabel used to swim here, even in the cold. She said it made her feel like her body belonged to her again." Mela sat beside him. "Did she talk to you about things before she left?" "Sometimes, but I was too proud to listen properly. I thought I was helping her by being critical. I thought strength meant telling someone how to survive instead of just sitting with them while they figured it out. She probably just wanted someone to stay. I know that now." Mela glanced out at the lake. "I don't know how to grieve people I never met." He looked at her now. "What do you mean?" "My mother died when I was 8. I have fragments of her, a voice, a smell, a moment. But she wasn't really a person in my memory. She was more like an idea, someone everyone else described for me. I don't know if I miss her or the idea that I could have been different if she'd stayed." "That's still grief," he said softly, "even if it doesn't look the way you expected it to." They sat in silence again. This time it wasn't heavy. It was grounding. Two people sitting with the weight of ghosts and not needing to carry them alone. After a while, Mila took off her shoes and walked into the shallows. The water was freezing, but she didn't flinch. She stood there, ankle deep, arms crossed loosely, eyes closed. She wasn't trying to be dramatic. She just needed to know she could still feel something without it overwhelming her. August stayed on the shore, watching, not intruding, not interpreting, just letting her exist. When she stepped out, he handed her a towel from the car without a word. She wrapped herself in it, teeth chattering slightly, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in days. Back at the house, she didn't go straight to her room. Instead, she followed him into the study. He lit a fire, and they sat on opposite ends of the couch, letting the warmth seep into the space between them. She spoke first. "I used to think survival meant becoming unrecognizable, making myself smaller, quieter, less inconvenient." August didn't interrupt. "But I think maybe survival is something different. Maybe it's just letting someone see you and not running when they don't look away." He met her eyes. "You don't have to run anymore. I don't know if I know how to stay." "You don't have to, not yet. Just don't disappear." She nodded and for the first time leaned back against the couch and let her body relax. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought of the lake, of the way the cold water had shocked her system and reminded her she was alive, of the way August hadn't reached for her or tried to shape her pain. He had just let her have it, let her speak, let her return. It wasn't love. It wasn't safety in the traditional sense, but it was starting to feel like trust, and that, she realized, was infinitely rarer. Mela had always believed that silence meant disconnection. In the group homes, silence was punishment, the withdrawal of attention and warmth. In her foster homes, it was the cold edge of neglect. But here, in the house with August, silence was different. It didn't always carry weight. Sometimes it was simply space, breathing room, a pause rather than a threat. After the lake, that silence deepened, became almost companionable, like two people learning how to speak again, but starting from trust instead of noise. Days passed with a strange calm. She helped more around the house, not because she was asked to, but because it felt natural. She'd always cleaned up after herself, always been the one who swept the floor when others left messes behind. But here it wasn't about being invisible or useful. It was about making her presence real, even if she couldn't name what that meant yet. August didn't comment on the change. He noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but he let her take up space at her own pace. Sometimes he would pass by as she arranged books or folded blankets and offer a soft word. Something like, "You made the room warmer." And then he'd keep walking. She'd never heard compliments given that way before, without expectation, without a hook. Just offered and then released, like a stone gently placed in the palm and not forced to be held. It was in the second week after the lake that something shifted again. She had been reading in the library, curled on one of the deep leather chairs that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The book was an old novel, one she barely remembered starting but now couldn't put down. Outside, the wind scraped along the windows in soft gusts, and the faint hiss of rain returned, as if the house was being wrapped in a wet cocoon. She liked the rain now. It meant no one would come. It meant the world outside paused too. She didn't hear him enter the room, but she felt it. The shift in the air, the quiet change in energy. August sat across from her without speaking. He had a habit of entering rooms like he'd always been there, like his body belonged in spaces before he filled them. She glanced up from her book, and for a moment their eyes met without intention, and she felt it, the unspoken current that had begun to hum between them. He wasn't staring at her. It wasn't like that. His gaze was direct but soft, the way someone looks when they aren't trying to possess or judge, just understand. It was unbearable in its gentleness. No one had ever looked at her that way before. He broke the silence first, his voice quiet. "You're not afraid of me anymore." She closed the book and rested it on her lap. "Should I be?" "No," he said. "But you were." "Yes," she admitted. "And maybe I still am. Just not in the way you think." He tilted his head. "In what way then?" Mala took a long breath, letting it settle deep in her lungs before releasing it. "I'm afraid that if I let you matter, I won't know how to protect myself anymore. I've spent years not letting anyone in. I learned how to survive alone. You complicate that." He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was lower, less measured. "You're not alone anymore, Mila. Not unless you choose to be." She looked away then, not out of shame, but because the truth of it felt too big to meet head on. That night, everything changed again. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even discussed. But something in the air felt different, tangible, trembling at the edges. She was in the kitchen late, making tea. The rain had returned full force, drumming on the roof and streaking down the windows like the sky was dissolving itself. She had just poured the hot water when she heard him behind her. Not close, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. She turned and found him leaning against the doorway, barefoot, in a black long-sleeved shirt and sweatpants, looking like someone who'd been fighting sleep all evening and finally given up. His hair was slightly damp, his expression unreadable but open. He looked human, tired, real. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly. She nodded. "Me neither." They didn't speak again for a few minutes. She poured a second cup and handed it to him without ceremony. He accepted it, their fingers brushing just slightly as she passed it. The contact was accidental, brief, but it was the first time they'd touched skin to skin. It left a quiet thrum in the air, as if some current had been sparked, and now neither of them could pretend not to feel it. He gestured toward the living room. She followed. They sat on opposite sides of the long couch, but over time, the space between them lessened. It wasn't intentional. It was instinctive. Two people sliding into proximity without noticing how far they'd come. They talked not about anything important. Books, places they had never been, food they hated as children, but it was the most intimate conversation they'd had. And sometime between midnight and dawn, the distance between them finally disappeared completely. She didn't remember how it happened exactly, if it was his hand that reached for hers or hers for his, but suddenly they were holding on to each other, palms flat, fingers resting like puzzle pieces, finding their fit. It wasn't erotic. It wasn't desperate. It was grounding. His hand was warm and slightly rough, like someone who still used tools despite his wealth. She ran her thumb along his knuckles and felt him inhale softly. "I've never touched anyone like this," she said, surprised by her own voice. "Like what?" "Without fear." August looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. Not lust, not even love. Something deeper, something like reverence. "I've never been touched like this either," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, slowly, carefully, like testing a bridge built in a storm. He didn't move away. He adjusted, wrapping an arm around her. Not tightly, not possessively, just there, holding her, present. They stayed that way until morning. No kisses, no unraveling. Just skin against skin, warmth against quiet, breath against the history of too many nights spent alone. When she finally drifted to sleep, it was with her head on his chest and her hand still in his. Their fingers curled loosely like vines growing toward one another, no longer afraid of being seen. The next morning came with light that felt different. It wasn't the soft, hesitant glow of most days in the house. It was stronger, clearer, as if the sun had finally remembered how to rise with purpose. The windows glowed with pale gold, illuminating the textures of the wooden floor and casting long shadows across the library walls. Mila woke slowly, still on the couch, her head resting where it had fallen hours before, against August's shoulder. Her fingers were still curled around his, their hands resting quietly between them like something sacred that neither of them dared to move just yet. She didn't speak when her eyes opened. She didn't have to. August was already awake. His body was still, but his breath was steady, his gaze out the window unfocused, as if watching a world she couldn't yet see. When he finally turned to look at her, there was something new in his expression. Not wonder, not fear. It was something older, relief maybe, a quiet acknowledgement that they had crossed a boundary not with words or declarations, but with stillness, with proximity. She sat up slowly, stretching, and looked at him. His eyes followed her every movement, but not like someone studying or analyzing her. It was closer to observation, born from deep care, like he was memorizing the fact that she was still here. "I should have gotten up," she said. "I didn't mean to fall asleep on you." "I didn't move," he replied. "I didn't want to wake you." "You could have." "I didn't want to." The simplicity of his words didn't need explanation. There was no apology, no awkwardness. Just a shared understanding that whatever had happened during the night, whatever that closeness meant, it wasn't something either of them wanted to undo. The quiet lingered as they moved into the kitchen, this time more comfortably, like the night had carved a different kind of rhythm into their movements. August brewed coffee while Maela opened the windows, letting in the scent of the morning trees and damp soil. They moved around each other with a growing ease, neither choreographed nor clumsy. It felt domestic, strangely natural, and that thought both comforted and unnerved her. Because what came after softness was always risk. After breakfast, the house phone rang. It almost startled them both. It rarely rang. August froze mid-step, his eyes narrowing slightly. Mela watched him as he walked to the small phone mounted in the hallway, lifted the receiver, and said nothing. Just listened. His body went rigid. Not visibly, not dramatically, but she saw it. The way his jaw clenched, the way he shifted his weight as if preparing for something heavy. When he hung up, he stood still for a moment. Then he turned toward her. "That was my attorney," he said calmly. "A story is coming out. About you. About us." Her chest tightened. "What kind of story?" "Someone leaked the transfer document, the one your guardian signed. They're saying I bought you." Her mouth went dry. She leaned against the kitchen counter to steady herself, the edge digging into her back like a reminder to stay upright. "So what now?" "I'm handling it," he said. "We don't have to speak to anyone. I can keep your name out of it." "But it's already out there, isn't it?" He hesitated. "Yes." She nodded slowly, the weight of it sinking in. Her past, the chaos, the secrecy, the strange silence of this place, it was no longer invisible. Now it had a headline. August walked toward her, but stopped a few feet away, giving her room to breathe. "You don't have to be involved. I'll take the fallout, all of it." Mila looked at him hard, her voice even. "Is that what you think I want? To hide again? To let you take the blame while I disappear?" "No," he said, "but I want you to have that choice." She looked away. Her reflection caught faintly in the glass of the microwave door. She barely recognized herself. Hair a little longer, skin not as hollow, shoulders not as tense, but her eyes were still hers, still sharp, still unyielding. "I'm tired of being erased from my own story," she said. "If they're going to write it anyway, they might as well hear the truth from me." He exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then we'll do it your way." The rest of the day was strange. Quiet, but not in the usual way. It was the silence of waiting. Anticipation hung in the rooms like humidity, sticky and unshakable. Mela stayed near the windows, watching the distant movement of clouds, of cars at the edge of the property line. She could feel the world moving closer, could feel its claws ready to drag her back into a version of herself that no longer existed. By evening, reporters had arrived at the gate. Cameras, microphones, drone footage. They weren't interested in the truth. They wanted spectacle. A rich man, a young girl, a contract. It was the kind of headline that wrote itself. August's legal team sent a formal response. They denied nothing, but carefully framed every decision. Consent, care, guardianship laws. There were no accusations of assault, no criminal charges. But that didn't matter to the public. The court of perception was louder than any lawyer. Mela spent the night on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars appear one by one, like bruises blooming in the sky. August sat beside her, silent. "They'll say you groomed me," she said eventually. "They'll say I didn't know what I was doing. I know. They'll make you a villain. I already was to them." She turned toward him, her face illuminated by the soft gold from the outdoor lights. "And what if I say I love you?" His eyes flickered, not from surprise, but from fear. "Then I'll believe you," he said. "But I won't ask you to say it to save me." "I'm not saying it to save you," she whispered. "I'm saying it because no one ever looked at me like I was more than what I came from. You didn't try to fix me. You just stayed." He reached for her hand again, slowly, and this time, there was no hesitation. And in the dark, surrounded by silence and the oncoming judgment of a world that would never understand them, she held on to him with both hands. Not as someone broken, not as someone owned, but as someone who had finally decided she was allowed to stay. The news cycle didn't last forever. No story ever did, no matter how salacious or seemingly scandalous. It burned bright for 2 weeks, lurid headlines, grainy photos of the estate taken by drones, speculation from strangers, opinion pieces penned by self-righteous columnists who claimed to understand the inner lives of people they had never met. They debated Mila's agency, August's character, their age gap, the ethics of wealth, the vulnerability of girls who grew up without choices. And then, just as quickly, the fire began to fade, replaced by a newer story with shinier outrage. But the damage was done. People who had never spoken to either of them now carried versions of them in their minds, distorted reflections of truth shaped by gossip and projection. August became a symbol of power, of guilt, of moral ambiguity. Miela was recast as everything from victim to temptress, depending on the outlet. There were days when the weight of it felt suffocating. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now buzzed with invisible noise, the ghosts of perception clinging to every surface. Still, Miela didn't leave. She thought she might. She even packed a bag once, folded her clothes neatly, and zipped the worn fabric like she used to in the group homes, methodically, pretending it didn't mean anything. But she didn't walk out. She sat on the edge of the bed for hours, bag at her feet, staring at the window until the light shifted and her thoughts stopped racing. She left the bag by the door for a few more days before finally putting it away. That act, quiet and simple, felt more like a declaration than anything she could have said out loud. August didn't ask her to stay. He never once tried to convince her. But she noticed the small things, the way he moved slower when she was nearby, the way he left the lights on in the hallway at night, the way he paused when saying goodnight. Like there was something else in his mouth he wasn't sure she was ready to hear. They didn't talk much about the headlines once the noise faded. Instead, they shifted back into a rhythm, still new, still tentative, but theirs. Mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons spent working in the garden behind the house, where Mila surprised herself by enjoying the feel of dirt under her fingernails, by watching something grow from her own hands. Evenings with books or films or quiet dinners made together in silence that no longer felt heavy. One night in early spring, they sat by the fireplace in the library. It was cold again, unexpected for the season, but the warmth from the flames cast soft shadows across the walls. Mila lay curled on the couch, legs tucked under her, a book resting on her chest. August sat nearby, not reading, just watching the fire like it might reveal something he hadn't yet understood. "I think I want to leave for a while," she said suddenly, breaking the quiet not with tension, but with clarity. His eyes didn't change. He simply nodded once. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Somewhere real, somewhere people don't know me, or think they do. Maybe a small town, maybe a big one. I want to see what I look like away from here, away from what happened. Not forever, just enough. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You were always free to go." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't." She left 3 days later. He drove her to the train station himself. No goodbye speech. No dramatic kiss. Just a bag, a ticket, and a long look at her as she stood by the platform. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know," she whispered, "but I might come back anyway." He smiled then. Soft, tired, real. "I hope so." Myla spent nearly 3 months away. She found a room in a quiet city by the coast, got a job shelving books at a small, struggling library, and started waking early to walk along the shore before the world was fully awake. She read. She wrote in a journal she never meant to share. She met people who asked her name and not her past. She discovered that healing didn't come in dramatic revelations, but in moments. Laughing at something stupid, feeling hunger and actually wanting to eat, waking up and not dreading the day ahead. And through it all, she didn't call. Not once. Not because she didn't miss him, but because she needed to know she could survive in the space between. That the version of herself she'd become beside August wasn't a fluke, wasn't dependent on proximity. She needed to know she was real even when no one was watching. When she returned to the house, it was unannounced. She didn't call ahead. She didn't warn him. She arrived at dusk, just as the sun was beginning to disappear behind the hills, and stood at the gate with her single bag and her heart in her hands. The house looked the same, quiet, gray, dignified, but something about it felt warmer, like it had been waiting. She walked up the steps slowly. Before she could knock, the door opened. August stood there. He didn't look surprised. He didn't speak right away. Then softly he said, "I knew it would be tonight." She stared at him for a long moment, then smiled. Not wide, not bright, but the kind that came from somewhere deep. "I still don't know what this is," she said. "Neither do I," he replied. "But I know I want it," she added. "Whatever it becomes." He stepped aside to let her in, and this time she didn't hesitate. She walked through the doorway like she belonged, like she had chosen it, like she had chosen him, because she had. Not out of desperation, not out of obligation, but out of love. Quiet, earned, undeniable. And for the first time in both of their lives, that was more than enough.